Okay, this is Robert from Transpara, and today we're going to dive deep into the remote context service or server, depending on what you like to call it, and really cover all the core concepts of it. With me is Michael Saucier and Christian Luckock. Hey,
Hello.
guys.
Hey, Robert.
And we're going to keep this casual and just go through a little bit of interview of these really smart guys who know all about this. And we're going to show quite a bit. So let's dive right into it. We have an agenda here where we're going to talk about what is this thing called a remote context service and what does it mean to automate Visual KPI, even a few ways outside the RCS to automate. We're going to talk about how it relates to the designer and why you still need the designer and what it's doing in that context. We're going to talk about the productized remote context servers that we have, as well as how one gets created in SQL, so more of a custom remote context server that you can do in different ways against different sources. We'll talk very briefly about the designer, and then we'll show one of those productized ones. We'll have Michael show the OSIsoft AF RCS, which is the first one we ever made. And then we will switch over to Christian, where he'll go kind of into the guts and do a little bit more technical training about how one gets made against any SQL source there. And along the way, we're going to cover a bunch of other topics, which you can see later in the agenda. We'll either cover them as we go or we'll separate them out at the end and some commonly asked questions. So guys, are you ready to dive in?
Oh, I was born ready.
I hope so. Well, mostly it's going to be me for a minute. So let's see. Let's remind everybody where this fits in the big puzzle that's called Visual KPI. So if you've taken any of the other training courses, like the end user training or the designer training or interfaces, you might be familiar with this slide. So Visual KPI reads data, and that's usually the raw data, from any one or many data sources you may have. And the way that it does that is through interfaces. And that's how you're going to get a data like a price or a temperature or anything like that that you may be pulling out of one or many systems. Okay, so that is the interface side. And when we talk about this second section, where we often refer to it as decorating your data with things for the purposes of visualizing it, for the purposes of organizing it into a hierarchy that you can drill down and that will roll up performance for you, for the purposes of analytics and for the purposes of alerting, we talk about this second section. And usually when I'm talking about it, it's about there's two ways you can get this type of information into Visual KPI. One is the Visual KPI Designer, which is the manual way. And the second is the remote context server, which is what this course is going to be all about. And so that is how you automate it. So if you have an external source that either already has the appropriate metadata for us to run Visual KPI with, or if you have a place where that metadata can go and you want to have a single source of that metadata, so you're never changing something in one of your systems and then having to come over to Visual KPI and change it again, that's where the remote context server comes in. And so that's the automation part of this. And so as we go through the rest of what Visual KPI can do, it's this second section here that we're going to be talking about today. Again, you can call it decorating your data, you can call it metadata, you can call it configuring our software, but we're going to talk about doing that automatically today. So where that fits in the architecture, you've got the Visual KPI server at the bottom here in the blue boxes on the right. You'll see those interfaces. This is where you might be talking to a historian or another time series database. You might be talking to SQL databases like SQL Server or Oracle or MySQL or Postgres. You might be talking to web services like weather data or pricing data or supplier information, et cetera. Lots of different interfaces. But if you go to the lower left, you may have a place where configuration data exists, or that metadata we just mentioned. And that could be the same database as your data, as we'll show in the SQL RCS demo that Christian's going to do, or it can be totally separate. You might get your metadata from one or even multiple sources and get your data from one or multiple sources that might be radically different from each other. So let's talk a little bit about what a remote context server does. Okay, and I'll start by showing on the left here an example or a couple screenshots from AF from OSIsoft. So one of many that we do a remote context server against. And at the top screenshot, you'll see a hierarchy. This is a data center example. We'll show you other ones today. But in the hierarchy there, you'll see I have servers. They belong to racks. They belong to other areas of the data center, which belong to zones, which belong to the data center itself eventually. And servers come and go and other things. So you'd never want to have to add servers manually in Visual KPI if you already have a master source for who knows these relationships. And then in the lower left, you'll see where the properties of those things live. And those map very well to the types of attributes Visual KPI is looking for. Things like the names and descriptions, the limits, the geolocation, all these other pieces that you can put in that system. And so on the left here, those are AF examples. And when you run a remote context server against them, it will create that hierarchy dynamically. It will create those KPIs. It will tell it where to go get its data from, etc. And if you make changes to the things on the left, if you add things, if you delete them, if you rename them, if you move them around in the hierarchy, the remote context server is looking for those changes and following along in Visual KPI. Therefore, you never have to come over and do that manual entry into Visual KPI. So this is great for not only high scale environments where you're going to see things coming and going all the time, but just places where you never want to do that double work. So it can read all kinds of information. We'll go into that in detail. You can also find documentation on our website and a reference guide that shows all the various attributes that a remote context server can work with, and even separated by which type of remote context server you're working with. Now, the last thing is in the lower right of this slide here, you'll see some of the ones that we already have that are productized, things like the AF one, or VMware, or Zabbix, or inmation, or Compass, etc. And then we'll spend a bunch of time today showing how we can do this against any other source as long as it's SQL based. And we'll talk about what goes into a remote context server when we do. Guys, anything you'd add to what I said about sort of what this does and why it exists?
Yeah, I would, Robert. It's a lot of people talk about having one source for the truth. And, that was a very catchy phrase a few years ago. What it's really evolved into is, I don't want another source of the truth. They have their sources, they have their existing data sets, and they don't want to just add another system that they have to maintain. So this gives them a way to take one of those systems or more than one of those systems and have those systems that they already use and maintain be the one source or the existing sources of the truth.